Uh, Thank you all for sticking around. Just start by thanking my co-authors, Jonelle and Wendy at USC. Uh, we put together this idea, this analysis about a year ago, and are really glad to be able to bring it here today. So the topic of loneliness is becoming increasingly salient. So it's becoming an important health issue. We know that it's related to many negative health outcomes. People across different demographic groups are experiencing loneliness to the point it's starting to be described as an epidemic by the Surgeon General of the US. And perhaps excellently showing how salient this is, we have 2 talks out of however many abstracts submitted to CIPHER, so a topic of great interest out in the research world. We have in this talk a bit of a different approach to the subject, specifically starting off by distinguishing between different dimensions of loneliness. So oftentimes you will see loneliness spoken about in terms of a broad loneliness and then a separate aspect of social isolation. You can also call these social loneliness for social isolation and emotional loneliness for what is generally just called loneliness. But social isolation is the idea that you have limited social interactions and a lack of belonging to a larger social network. Emotional loneliness is that internal feeling of being lonely, so a lack of intimate relationships with close others. And increasingly post-COVID, so in the last couple of years, there's been a lot of gendered discussion about the experience of loneliness, focusing on men and specifically young single men. And this has been talked about across a diverse set of publications. And this interested our research team as if there's all these lonely men, where are the lonely women? And as I imagine this is going to be the only point in my career I'm going to put a Reddit post on a slide that I take to a conference, but I found that it really, in a pithy manner, described the problem that may be the issue here. So male loneliness is seen as this social problem, but female loneliness is seen as a personal or an individual sort of issue. So is loneliness more prevalent among men during COVID, post-COVID, or is there an equal gender distribution? It's just we're focusing on men for whatever reason. And pre-COVID, there is at least some evidence that men are expressing more loneliness. So this is across hundreds of studies and a meta-analysis that looked at social loneliness, emotional loneliness, different subgroups of participants, different ways of measuring loneliness, et cetera, and compiled across all of the studies. There is a very, very tiny but significant effect size under 0.1, where men are slightly more lonely, or at least reporting more loneliness. But during COVID, oh, and I should say that is both social and emotional loneliness. That did not describe any of the heterogeneity amongst effect sizes. And during COVID, as Samar described the other day, there is heterogeneity in the results, some finding no difference with pre-COVID loneliness levels. Some studies that came out a little bit after the onset of the pandemic did find some increases. I don't think any have found any of the other directions, so mixed evidence, but perhaps an increase in loneliness compared to prior years during the pandemic. And when looking at specific gender topics, which was not extremely common out in the literature, there was some evidence that women in particular were showing an increase in emotional loneliness, even though they had larger social networks. So larger social networks, but more emotional loneliness. And then studies looking at men looked more at the social network aspect, and men's social networks were shrinking, but emotional loneliness, at least in this study, wasn't investigated. So we were interested in following this up with some longitudinal data, so looking at change over time over the COVID-19 pandemic. And so our research questions looked at these lonely single men. So Were there gender differences in loneliness? Were there differences between those that lived with a romantic partner, so co-residence with a romantic partner? And then I'm a developmental psychologist, so we looked at age effects as well. For both social loneliness and then for emotional loneliness, also controlling for that social interaction in those models. And then for a third research question, if these differences were there during the pandemic, did they change over time? And we used the UAS COVID-19 data set. As explained yesterday, the loneliness item started in wave 4 and ran through wave 29. We did keep the final 3 measurement points that were separated by a month. And completion was quite excellent throughout the entire data set. We used the item that we're calling emotional loneliness. So during the past 7 days, how often have you felt lonely? And this is, aside from the specific focus on the covariates, probably the biggest departure between this study and that was reported by Samir yesterday. So we dichotomized this variable. So we felt that this was a little more ordinal in nature than we would have liked, 1 day or fewer, 1 to 2 days, 3 to 4 days, 5 to 7 days. And reporting no loneliness was the most common. So at wave 4, 65% of responses were that lowest level of emotional loneliness. So we dichotomize this to try to look at the risk of reporting loneliness in a logistic regression framework. And then for social loneliness, there were 4 separate items that looked at different types of interactions. So connecting socially with friends and family, having phone calls with these individuals, messaging or emailing family members or friends, and then time spent interacting. And this was a more continuous measure, 0 to 7 days out of the last week. How many times have you done these things? And we reverse coded so that increased numbers showed more loneliness rather than more interaction. And then we included age, co-residence with a romantic partner, which we were able to calculate combining a few variables, gender, and then dichotomize covariates of race, income, and education to put in as control variables. So for our research question related to social loneliness and then these different demographic characteristics, were there differences in social loneliness? Did they change across time? And in a mixed effects linear regression here with that continuous outcome variable, we did find a 3-way interaction between gender, age, and co-residence with a romantic partner. But the 4-way interaction, looking at change in this interaction across time, was not significant. So to unpack this relationship, I wish I had a laser pointer here, but the solid blue lines are males, the dotted lines are females. Our co-residence with a romantic partner is on the right, not living with a romantic partner is on the left. And we see a very similar relationship for males in both of these groups. There's a steady report of loneliness across age, pretty equal regardless of whether or not you live with a partner, and in all cases reporting more social loneliness than women. For the women, there's an effect of living with a romantic partner. So those that did not live with a romantic partner showed maybe slight increases in social loneliness with age, but if they lived with a romantic partner, showed a marked decrease in reports of social loneliness with age. So older women living with a partner were reporting the least amount of social loneliness. For the other set of research questions, are emotional loneliness differing by these demographic characteristics? We did find the 4-way interaction to be significant, which requires a bit of a larger graph that I'll need to speed through for time purposes. So thankfully, 2 of these variables, co-residence and gender, were dichotomized, and so we can look at the interaction for age in the probability of reporting emotional loneliness across time, separated by these 4 groups of men and women living without a partner and living with a partner. And the highest risk group was in the bottom left. This is younger females, younger being the top dotted line, younger females not living with a romantic partner at the beginning of the pandemic had an over 50% probability of reporting emotional loneliness. In general, emotional loneliness, the probability declined over time. I need to really speed through here. And just to point out, the most steady was males, older males living with a romantic partner had very low probability of reporting emotional loneliness and stayed steadily low throughout the pandemic. So quick summary, demographic effects with social loneliness, demographic effect differences across time in emotional loneliness. And what this means in terms of the narrative is that we didn't find consistent report here. So there is perhaps more of an issue with male social loneliness, so lesser social interaction, but at least in a risk of reporting emotional loneliness, it was younger women not living with a romantic partner who were the most at risk. And I'm out of time here, but I just wanted to say it's important to think about effects of marriage, whether or not these results are just a temporary response or representing a demographic shift, and also highlighting the importance of separating between the concepts of social and emotional loneliness. So thank you. Sorry to speed up so much at the end, but appreciate it.